What's good, guys? This is Rio, and today I'm in a 2020 BMW 330i. This particular car is the G20 chassis code in BMW terms, and that makes it the 7th generation 3 Series. So this car has a bit of a legacy going back almost 50 years, and why that's important is to contextualize how much of a legacy this car really has throughout the automotive industry. The 3 Series nameplate has been known to always be associated with one of the coolest, best cars you can buy. And unfortunately, over the last 5 to 10 years, sales have begun to dwindle a little bit because everybody wants a crossover or an SUV. So in the world of crossover craze, I want to figure out if this 3 Series, this 330i, is still an awesome car. So when I say 330i, some people, especially people who haven't been around the brand for about 15 years, think, okay, maybe it's a 3.3 liter, 6-cylinder. Well, as I'm sure some of you know, this is actually a turbocharged 2-liter 4-cylinder. And while the name on the back of the car doesn't make sense anymore, or correlate to the engine at least, I should say, this car makes 255 horsepower and 294 pound-feet of torque, which I should mention is only 1 pound-foot of torque less than the E90 series M3's made. So I'm not comparing a 330 to an M3, I'm just saying torque-wise, and the fact that yes, we've downsized from a naturally aspirated 6 that you used to find in the E93 series. You get torque that's more plentiful than even some older, higher level 3 Series were in the past. That's natural progression, of course, but what that means is this car actually, drivetrain-wise, is fairly sporty for a base level vehicle, which it currently is in the US. The 330 is the base version of the 3 Series. Now, speaking of sportiness, and I'll touch on this more when I'm driving, but I believe they've really upped the chassis and steering tuning on the new G20s as compared to the F30 chassis vehicles. And I think that was a big point of contention with the F30 because people were coming from E90s and E46s and so on and so forth, so accustomed to BMWs being tight, having tight steering, feeling light and nimble. And unfortunately, the F30 kind of went in the wrong direction, and this is starting to go back in the right direction. I'm not going to say that it has the steering of an E90, but it feels like a step in the right direction as compared to the F30. The last thing I want to mention before we take this car out on the road is the pricing. And this car, the 330, starts at about $40,000. However, this particular car was just a touch over $49,000, which honestly surprises me because it's missing quite a few things, but it still shows you that within that $40,000 range, you can get into a decently equipped 330i. And I think the 50s and lower 60s are more reserved for the M340i price-wise. And the new M3 is coming out, so I'm really excited for that. Although it doesn't have the front that this car has, it has the front of the new 4 Series, and that's a whole other point of contention amongst enthusiasts, but I digress. Let's take this out for a drive and see really what I think about it. Okay, so pulling this car out on the road, one of the first things I notice is one of the things that I just mentioned, which is the steering. So this car, and I'm actually in sport mode right now to tighten everything up a tiny bit, but I noticed that it doesn't feel dead on center the way it did in the F30. So you kind of have a little more control and a little bit more sense of the road. Again, nowhere near hydraulic steering, but a step in the right direction as compared to the F30. Another thing that I notice is the chassis tuning actually makes this car feel a bit sportier than I think the drivetrain would otherwise make you feel. So the drivetrain is sporty and does have a decent amount of power for a base level vehicle, but the chassis kind of gets you engaged. I find myself wanting to push this car a lot more than I do in certain other cars of this relative trim level. Now, speaking of the competition, this car mainly competes with the Audi A4 and the Mercedes C-Class. Both great cars, but it's worthy to note that the A4 starts as a front-wheel drive car and even in its quattro form is slightly front-wheel drive biased. And the C-Class is rear-wheel drive. Both that and this can be had in all-wheel drive, but I prefer both of them in rear-wheel drive, and this car in particular, with its slightly sporty dynamics, is perfectly paired with rear-wheel drive and really gets you wanting to push it and gets you wanting to be a little more aggressive on the gas pedal than I would have expected in a more base vehicle. So BMWs of the last 10 or 15 years have been criticized largely for having outdated interiors. And I can tell that BMW is definitely trying to flip the script when it comes to that because all the newer BMWs have fantastically updated interiors, and this is no exception. So stepping out of an F30, getting into a G20, there's just no way to avoid how much nicer the interior feels. Notably is the digital cluster, One of the downsides is you can't customize as much of this digital gauge cluster. All you can change is what's on the far right hand side by the tachometer and nothing else. As well as the new, more touchscreen inclined infotainment. So iDrive, this one you can talk to, you can say, hey, BMW, and it'll listen and pick up. Surprisingly isn't right now. Some of the iDrives of the last couple of years also had touchscreen, but you could tell just the way the UI was made, you're really meant to use the controller. And with this car, it feels a little bit more natural to use the actual touchscreen. I still actually prefer the controller because I can't stand smudging up the screen, but it is much more intuitive to use as a touchscreen than ever before, and it's a real step in the right direction for BMW. One of the only low points of this particular car is that it's not an M Sport, thus you don't get the M Sport steering wheel, which is really not a huge deal. This is still a decent steering wheel. I just prefer the M Sport steering wheel for the fact that it's a little chunkier and uses slightly nicer leather and also has a slightly nicer design. So I guess my attitude is you have to touch a steering wheel every single day, so why not have it be the coolest, nicest, most pleasant steering wheel you could possibly have? So the fact that it's an option, I would ultimately say I would look to get one of these as an M Sport trim. However, there is that complication of if you get a super loaded 330 M Sport, a bunch of options, a few options this car is missing, you can easily get into the mid to high 50s, at which point I would just go ahead and honestly swing for a lower trim leveled M340 because you get so much other stuff. Even if you miss out on some of the tech and luxury, you're getting a bigger motor. Now, a lot of people disagree with me on this tactic. I just believe that if you're gonna spend almost, let's say $57,000 for a 330, you might as well get a $59,000 M340 because you get so many other things on top of the steering wheel and the design and the looks. Now, one of the things that I really do like about this car, and it's a huge upgrade from the F30, just like the entire car itself, is the keyless access. So now it has little functions such as if you walk up to the car with the key in your pocket, without even touching the door handle, it'll unlock all the doors. Now you can turn this feature off, and it can be a little bit annoying at times, but it's cool that just like a Tesla, it senses your presence within a certain radius of the car and then knows to unlock all the doors without you having to even touch anything. Another thing, it has remote start. So again, something you could not even get on the F30s. You can start this with its key as an option, but it is a nice little touch. The sunroof's a little bit bigger, which I'm not a big sunroof guy. I like M cars with the carbon fiber slick tops, but on a base 330, it's nice to have a sunroof, and it's nice that it's a little larger and more fitting with the times. An upgrade from the F30 once again. Other little things that seem like pretty nice upgrades, these tend to be across the entire BMW line, but nonetheless make me very happy, is the light switches, which have gone from being a traditional switch to now buttons. And the convenience of the buttons is the car can reset itself to auto, even if someone's turned the lights off. Let's say a mechanic has turned the lights off to work on the vehicle, which they do for battery purposes. Well, the car can put itself back into auto after a certain period of time instead of the switch being left in zero and you driving around at night with your lights off. And generally speaking, you can tell that BMW has put a lot of thought into the form and function and design of all these things. And I've always believed that BMW, compared to the majority of its segment, largely Audi and Mercedes, actually is a bit more intuitive when it comes to the way they design things. Now, before I forget, let's jump into the tall boy test and then we'll wrap the car up after. So here's the tall boy test. So the car did okay on the tall boy test. Definitely not as good as the C-Class, which I will link up above because that car absolutely killed. And until the Chevy Suburban, that was the most that any car has fit so far, even more than some big Audi SUVs. So really impressive. Definitely check that out. So going on to some of the low points of this car, one of them is the speaker system. Now there is an upgradable Harman Kardon, which I'm always a big fan of when it comes to Harman Kardon and BMWs, and I've heard that specific system. It sounds pretty great. This system, not so great. It really forces you to crank a lot of volume out of it to really start hearing a song, and I can't stand when a speaker system requires that. I feel like it's one of the biggest signs that a system isn't that great. But yeah, other than that, not too many low points. I don't love that they got rid of the Hofmeister kink. I think that it was such an iconic BMW thing. I mean, they didn't get rid of it, but they just made it different, and it kind of in some ways is cool, but in a lot of other ways has ruined an iconic BMW design staple. So interesting choice there. And there are some overall interesting choices BMW's made regarding the exterior design of this car. One is the headlights. They're a little funky with a little like indent in them. I'm not a huge fan of that indent. I think that it kind of ruins a little bit of the headlight design. The grills are pretty large. They have active air so they can open and close, which is kind of cool. And they're not as big as the new 4 Series, which is crazy, but they are pretty large. And because this is a non-M Sport, I'm not a huge fan of some of the lower trimming on the front or the back. They have like weird aero designed plastic. It's just not my favorite, especially compared to how a base Audi A4 looks. Although I would argue all those cars, the A4, the C-Class, and 3 Series look better in their sportier trims or body kits. I will mention that these are actually the middle trim level headlights. So there is a really base headlight. These are technically LED, and then there's an adaptive laser headlight, which looks really cool. These are also really cool. I just don't like the very base headlights. The adaptive laser lights just have the coolest daytime running lights. Definitely cooler than this car, but not, I mean, this cars are fine when you compare it to the base headlights to the base headlights DRL. The taillights, regardless of trim, are always going to be the same, and they're now 3-dimensional, which is pretty cool. They also slightly resemble a Lexus RC's taillights to me, and I think a lot of other people tend to agree. So I don't love that. The fact that they resemble another car's taillight isn't my favorite. And I actually tend to like the rear end of the F30 chassis more, just relatively speaking. Some people tend to hugely disagree with that. The seats are fantastic. They have great side bolstering adjustability, even in this non-M Sport trim, which I think is fantastic. You don't find that in the Audi nor the Mercedes, so you can really get them wrapped around you and feeling nice. Rear seat leg room is also fantastic. And surprisingly, while this car, of course, has grown a bit, it does actually feel more nimble than the F30 because of the chassis tuning. So when you're driving it a bit more aggressively, you get a lot more brake feel earlier in the pedal travel, and I prefer that. And the steering is a bit more snappy as well. I do like, so although the rear end design, partially due to the lights, I'm not the biggest fan of, at least compared to the F30, what I do like a lot is they've moved from having 2 exhaust tips on one side, so twin pipes on one side, to having dual pipes, one on either side, within the 330, so that seems like a big improvement to me. Kind of in line with the C-Class and the A4 having made the same switch in the previous gen, so now BMW is up to date in that regard. And overall, I think in the M Sport trim, this car looks really cool. I'm a big sucker for the white on black BMW look. This is also very cool in the all blacked out tinted aesthetic, but it's not my exact cup of tea because M Sport alone is like a huge must-have when it comes to BMWs for me. I gotta also mention the tack being reverse direction. I'm also not a fan of. It's definitely weird when you're using the paddle shifters to have the tack that way. It is really cool though in Eco Pro mode, where it shows you your MPGs and is able to switch the entire gauge cluster in a way that previous BMWs without having digital screens couldn't do. So lastly, I want to talk about some of the things that this car could have as options that it does not. So the adaptive laser headlights are one of the options. You could also have a further executive suite where you get gesture control, head-up display, the upgraded audio system, as I mentioned. So there are some other things this car can have, and adaptive cruise control, which some people believe is an absolute must, and I don't completely disagree. I think that'd be a really nice touch in this car, but what it does have is still an active safety suite. So you have a button here you can press, and you can mess around with how much steering vibration you get if you're swerving from your lane. You have blind spot detection. You have a pretty decent camera system. Again, you could have even more cameras, and you can have actually a 3D camera system where you can pan the entire car on the screen. This car is missing that, but this is about a mid-equipped vehicle, so I'm not super surprised that it's missing some of these features. Largely speaking, this is a car that I'm a huge fan of, and when it comes to vibe checks, this is definitely a vibe. Definitely a vibe. But I would spec it a little bit differently. White on black, M Sport. Otherwise, besides the speaker system, I'm cool with it as is. These base wheels look okay. I'm not a huge fan of the metallic gray color on them. I wish they were just alloy personally, but some people like that almost gray blacked out look, so it doesn't surprise me that BMW is following people's desires and going that direction, although on the M Sport you can get a fully blacked out shadow line black. It doesn't surprise me that people want X3s instead of this for the practicality and even the capability, but I would say that if you want something sportier than an X3, this actually gets that job perfectly done. And on that note, I'm out. This is your boy Rio. Thank you for watching. Tune back in for more, and also remember to subscribe, like, comment, all that. Peace.